Hi friends, I'm Sarah. Welcome back to my channel, Sunset Bow Tarot. So I kind of got the idea for a hashtag that I wanted to start. So what happened is a couple weeks back, I did a video where I was talking about my hug decks. And there were a couple of decks that I mentioned as being hug decks, but they were hug decks for like a particular part of me internally or a particular part of me in my past. Like there were decks that were hugs for my inner child or hugs for my inner angsty 15-year-old. And a couple of people commented on it, and it got me thinking that it would be really interesting to find out from people which decks you think would have appealed to you at certain ages in your life, and kind of, which decks are decks that you think you might have loved as a child or might have loved as a teenager, might have loved in your early 20s, or, I want to leave this really open-ended for people to talk about it in whatever way that they want to talk about it. But it is interesting for me to see how people, change and grow over their lifetime. And I would be very interested to know how people think their taste in decks has changed and grown over their lifetime, and what decks they think might have appealed to younger versions of them. So I thought about calling this hashtag decks for all ages. And then I remembered that COPA is a thing, and none of us want to flag any of our videos probably as being for all ages. So I was trying to think of another good name for the hashtag. So I decided to call it Decks Through the Ages. And again, basically this is really open-ended. The idea is just to talk about what decks you might have liked at a particular age. These are the decks I might have liked as a child. These are the decks I might have liked as a teenager. These are the decks I might have liked as a young adult. And, only kind of what phases you've gone through in your life and when you've grown and changed as a person. So, however people want to define this, I think is totally okay. But anyway, I thought I would talk a little bit about decks that I think that would have appealed to me at younger ages and why I think they would have appealed to me. There will be a little bit of overlap, obviously, between this and my hug decks video, because some of the decks that I talked about in that video will also obviously be in this video, but we'll go ahead and get started. So the first deck that I want to mention is one that was already in my other video, and I mentioned this deck as being like a hug for my inner child, and this is absolutely a deck that I would have adored as a child, and that is the Crystal Unicorn Tarot. So I've talked about this one already, so I won't talk about it too much, but I really love this deck. As a kid, I would have loved the palette of this deck. I would have loved the theme. I would have loved that all of the unicorns have crystals on their butts, so it reminds me of like My Little Pony, where they all had the little like symbol on their butt. Do you guys remember that from My Little Pony? This is like unicorn My Little Ponies in a deck, all pastel, all candy colored. These cards like look like they're made of cotton candy, and I would have friggin' adored this deck as a kid. So anyway, yeah, this is absolutely a deck that child Sarah would have been obsessed with. Another deck that I think child Sarah would have been obsessed with, and this is specifically because as a kid, I really liked Sanrio characters, and specifically, I loved the Little Twin Stars. Do you guys all remember the Little Twin Stars? In the early 80s, the Little Twin Stars were my whole jam. I had all Little Twin Stars stuff. My sister had all Hello Kitty stuff, but I was all about the Little Twin Stars. And the deck that reminds me of the Little Twin Stars is the Delos Tarot. And I swear to God, the faces of the people in this deck look like exactly like the Little Twin Stars to me. Well, the cat doesn't. But the people in this deck have that same sort of like oval, just black eye that the Little Twin Stars had. And so my Sanrio love as a child would have 100% made this deck my whole entire jam. And then there's fairies and crystals on the backing. I mean, I would have been so into this as a kid. So that is the Delos Tarot. A final deck, and this one I think will also come as no surprise to people, that I would have loved as a kid. And again, I have a specific connection with it to a specific thing that I remember and really love from my childhood, and that is the Forest of Enchantment Tarot. But does anybody remember the game Enchanted Forest? There was a game, it's a Ravensburger game, I think it still exists, called Enchanted Forest, and it was my favorite board game as a kid, and it's really cool. You walk through the forest with your little character, and you go from tree to tree, and you look under the tree, and under the tree will be some kind of fairy tale artifact, like, you know, the golden ball from the Frog Prince, or you know, the belt from the, you know, Brave Little Tailor, or, you know, whatever it might be, 7 League Shoes, or Sleeping Beauty's spindle, Cinderella's glass slippers, all those kinds of things. But anyway, you went from tree to tree to find which tree these artifacts were under, and then when you found the artifact that you were supposed to find, you would go back to the castle and say that you found it, and you would have to identify which tree it was under. Anyway, I was obsessed with that game as a kid, and this deck reminds me of that game. So this would have been another deck that was totally my jam as a child, is the Enchanted Forest Tarot. So let's move on into my teenage years. So as an early teen, I'd say around 14, 15, I think the deck that would have most appealed to me would definitely have been the Crystal Visions Tarot. That was an age where I was really reading a lot of fantasy novels. And this is the deck that I already identified in my other video as being a hug for my inner angsty 15-year-old. But this deck reminds me of the covers of all of the fantasy novels that I read at that age. There's even a card in this deck that has a woman riding a dragon, and I can't even convey to you how many Anne McCaffrey books I read when I was a teenager. There was a constant teetering pile of Anne McCaffrey books that I borrowed from a friend who owned all of them. But there was like a constant teetering pile of them on my desk when I was a teenager, in my room. And I would always like be holed up in my room reading a fantasy novel. Here's a dragon card. And this deck is 100% the aesthetic that I was into at the time. I also wanted to write my own fantasy novel at the time. I had a friend where we were like trying to co-write a fantasy novel together. And then, you guys, she lost all the pages that we had written somewhere in the halls at school. And I still, to this day, like, there was drawings that I had done. It freaks me out so much. It's like when Angela's note to Jordan Catalano got lost in the museum on My So-Called Life. Like, it destroyed me personally. But anyway, the fantasy novel lover in me in my early teens would have absolutely loved this deck. So as I got into my late teens, I'd say I became a lot more politically aware. I joined the debate team in high school, and I really, really learned a lot from that about politics and what was going on in the world around me. And I think I had a really privileged childhood in that I didn't have to become aware of that stuff until I was in my late teens. You know, a lot of people don't have the privilege of not being aware of that kind of stuff. I did. You know, I went through childhood in a very, very privileged way. But, you know, when I got into my late teens, that was when I really started understanding the importance of things like diversity and representation. So I think that the deck that would have really appealed to me at that age is the This Might Hurt Tarot. I think that this deck does a really great job of, here are the backs, reflecting the world that we actually live in, which was a world that I was just really becoming aware of at that age. And again, I know that that's like a really privileged position to be in, to only become aware of the world that we actually live in at that age, at a relatively late age in life. But I think that this deck does such a good job of diversity and representation and representing the modern world. And so I really think that this is one that would have really resonated with me at that age. Yeah, this is the This Might Hurt Tarot. So, a super cool and beautiful deck. So as I got into college, I actually went to a Catholic university, and I'm not Catholic, and I went for various other reasons that had nothing to do with the fact that the university was Catholic, but basically I ended up as a college student in a rather conservative institution in my hometown. And I ended up responding to that by becoming a women's studies major and being really pissed off all the time and writing a lot of letters to the school newspaper. So anyway, I think that feminism became really, really important to me as a college student. And I think that the deck that would have really, really appealed to me at that age is the Gorgon Tarot. I do think that there are a lot of really strong feminist aspects to this deck, but there's also something about this deck and just the way that it speaks to, it kind of maps what my psychological landscape was like at the time. This deck, the best way I can describe this deck is that this deck feels like a Tori Amos song to me. I was obsessed with Tori Amos at that age. I would have loved the fact that this deck was black and white. And when I was in college, I would have loved the fact that this deck feels like it was computer generated. Like this deck has a very sort of, in some places it looks almost pixelated. Like it has this very sort of like late 90s computer art feel to it. And so I feel like this deck would have been just my whole jam when I was in college. So that is the Gorgon's Tarot. So as I got out of college and went into law school, this would have been around the early 2000s, that was really when I think I started developing a more spiritual side to my politics. And I think that in a lot of ways that was kind of a reaction to being in law school, because it's a very rigid kind of structure that you're entering into in a lot of ways. And you know, mentally speaking, I needed a different kind of a different kind of study and a different kind of like way of connecting to the world. I was really finding that the way that I was connecting to the world felt limiting to me, and I really needed to explore other ways of other ways of making those connections. That's a very bad description, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at. But so as a result of that, I think that the deck that would have really appealed to me around that age is the Dark Goddess Tarot. Those are the backs. Anyway, here's the box. This is the out of print version, but I know this deck is coming out mass market really soon, which I think is wonderful. But this is one of those decks where obviously, you know, as the Dark Goddess deck, there is a really, really strong feminist aspect to it. At that time in my life, I was really interested in learning about mythology, and so this deck would have really, really resonated with me, and I would have found it fascinating. I still do, obviously, but at the time, you know, this is when I really would have started finding it fascinating to learn about all of these different goddesses. I had become, in the sort of very like last year of college, aware that goddess-based religion was actually a thing, which is a story that I will tell in a different video. But this deck, I think, would have really, really resonated with me at that time. And so I really love this one. This is an absolutely amazing deck. So that is the beautiful Dark Goddess Tarot. So also at the time, I was very, very interested in Arthuriana, which I think is part of the reason why my first tarot deck, as I actually just recently remembered, in 2003 was actually Legend, the Arthurian Tarot. So here's my trimmed copy of it that I recently rebought after realizing that I had no idea what I had done with that copy that I had owned back in the early 2000s. Yeah, I mean, at the time, I think I was reading a lot of Arthurian novels, and I was rediscovering some of the ones that I had read as a younger person. Like when I was younger, I had read books like The Mists of Avalon and Mary Stewart's Arthurian novels. And when I was in law school, was kind of rediscovering those, because I was kind of rediscovering that sort of thirst for reading fantasy, and you know, I needed an escape and an outlet when I was in law school. So I think that type of reading really provided that. So that's Legend, the Arthurian Tarot. So anyway, those are my responses to decks through the ages, which I think is a good name for the hashtag. So basically, I kind of took things up through my mid to late 20s, because that's kind of where it felt like, you know, up until that point there, I really kind of went through phases where I was really growing and changing and developing a lot. I mean, I've definitely had phases since then, but, you know, when you get to be an adult, it's not quite as pronounced, I'd say. But it was really interesting to sort of think back over what connections I could draw between different decks, and, you know, what I was going through at a particular time, what I was interested in, what I loved, what I was studying, what I was thinking about. So anyway, I would love to see other folks' thoughts on this. And again, I think this can be really open-ended. You know, I think that people will know best for themselves. I don't want to define particular ages, because I think people will know best for themselves, like what ages they really grew and changed, and kind of what phases they went through, and what interests they had at different points in their lives. So yeah, I'd just like to hear, you know, what were you like as a kid? What were you like as a teenager? What decks would you have liked? And how do those decks convey what you were like back then? So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this, and look forward hopefully to seeing other people's responses. So thanks so much. Bye.